Greetings friends and welcome to Premium Light Academy, your one-stop shop for improving your photography skills. Welcome back to Chapter 3 of our Lightroom for Beginners. Now if you're just now joining us, be sure to go check out Chapters 1 and 2, that way Chapter 3 will make a lot more sense. In this episode, we're going to jump into Lightroom's development module and start to harness the power of its incredible raw editing capabilities. So, let us begin.
All right, friends, welcome back to Lightroom for Beginners. We're in part 3, the development module. Now, if you're just now joining us, I recommend that you go back and watch parts 1 and 2 to help you catch up to where we are. But for a quick recap, let's see where we came from. We began by importing all of our pictures into the library. As you can see, we started off with a whole bunch of images from 3 different photo shoots. Next, we whittled things down into our collection series. We're working right now in Ashley and the Wheatfield, so we have 29 images on our initial cut, then we parse it down to 13, and at long last, we have sculpted our way down into our final 7 images. These are the photos that are ready to go into the development module, and this is where the fun begins. This is where we get to tinker around with creative edits. We get to make things brighter, we get to make things darker. So let's jump in and see what we've got. I'm going to start on my first image here, and then I'm going to go up to the top right and I'm going to click the development module. Now, as you can see, we have a series of tools on the right hand side. These are basically just sliders that allow us to start manipulating the pixels in this raw file. Now, this is in fact a raw file out of a Canon 5DSR. It's a 50 megapixel file. If we zoom in here, we can see that we've just got a huge amount of horsepower, and this gives us a lot of data to work with. When we move over here into our development module, you can see we have a series of basic tools. Right now I'm in the basic section. We've got a whole huge series of tools and we're going to go over a bunch of these, but right now let's start with basic. First and foremost, exposure. Basically, you drag the slider to the right, the image gets brighter. You drag the slider to the left, the image gets darker. I'm going to go ahead and zero that back out. Coming down, we have contrast. I typically don't use a whole lot of contrast when it comes to editing people, especially when you get into working with skin tones. You want to stay nice and moderate on your contrast. Highlights. If I grab this slider and I move down, as you can see, Lightroom is only targeting the highlight information. You can see Ashley's cheek starts to get a little bit brighter, a little bit over here on her shoulder. As I drag this down, the highlights are targeted and those are brought down. So Lightroom has a really nice way of targeting specific tonality, which gives us a great deal of control over our image. The same is true of shadows. If I grab my shadows, I'm going to see the darker tones in the image start to move up and down. Darks, blacks, all of these things, we can control these independently of the rest of the file. So let's zero these guys out and go back to normal once again. Moving down the line, we have vibrance and saturation. Now, these are 2 sliders that you want to be really careful with. This is one of the biggest beginner mistakes of all time. When you first get a hold of Lightroom, you first pick up a camera, people tend to go a little crazy on these saturation sliders. Again, when you're working with skin tones, you want to keep these nice and mellow. Right now, Ashley looks like she's just been irradiated by a nuclear bomb. Either that or she spent way too much time in a tanning bed, neither of which is true in reality. So let's zero those out as well. Moving down the line, we have a tone curve. Basically, this enables us to create a classic S-curve. I can kind of grab my highlights. This is sort of more of a fine-tuning version than the highlights and shadows up here. So if I can bring my highlights all the way up, I can bring my lights up a little bit, I bring my shadows down, and then I bring my darks and my shadows down. As you can see, we've started to create what we call an S-curve. All right, so in our tone curve, we have the highlights going up, midtones kind of stay the same, and then we S out at the bottom with the darks. Now, this is usually designed to give us a pretty nice parabolic contrast curve. But again, we want to take it easy when we're working with portraits, because as you can see, Ashley looks like she's just been hit with some insane Instagram filter, and we want to keep our images looking natural. So once again, I'm going to click on each of these and zero them back out, just as we kind of get an idea for what these things do. The Hsl Selector. This is one of the most powerful tools in all of Lightroom. It gives us an incredible amount of control using the color that we see in the image. So starting on the left, we have hue. Hue basically means that we can target one color and change it to a different color. If I go down in here, I see that there's a lot of orange, there's a lot of yellow in this image. So if I grab my yellow slider and I move it all the way to the left, all of the yellow in the image is specifically targeted and it changes color. You can see Ashley's sweater has literally just changed from yellow to orange, and it actually looks like a fairly natural edit despite all the other stuff. If I move this all the way to the right, it's grabbing those yellows and it's changing them. Actually, it's just making them a little bit on the green side. So let's zero this one back out and let's see what we get with orange. Once again, as you can see, we can either turn her into an Oompa Loompa or a kind of a crazy green zombie. Once again, you want to be careful using your hue selector, because the more we grab these sliders and move them off to the right or the left, the more we start to depart from reality. And we want to make sure that our images stay relatively close to reality, depending on the type of photo shoot that you're working on. So, saturation, once again, I can target specific colors in the image and I can move down with saturation. As you can see, there's a lot of orange building up in Ashley's skin. There's a lot of orange in this image, so I can completely desaturate just her skin, and I'm still left with all of the green tonality here. I haven't affected the greens. If I move this all the way to the right, once again, we get our nuclear bomb. She turns into an Oompa Loompa, so we want to be careful with saturation. Luminance. Now, luminance is a really cool curve. Basically, what this does is this allows us to treat each color as if it were tone. Basically, this allows us to target a color and make that specific color darker or brighter. So if I grab the oranges and I go darker, you can see there's a lot of orange in Ashley's face, and just the orange tones in her face and all around are getting darker. Again, we've left the greens alone because there is not much green, because we're just targeting the oranges. If we go to the right, her face gets really, really bright. She kind of turns into one of those weird vampires that sparkles in the sun. So once again, when we're working in the Hsl Color Palette, it gives us a great deal of power to target our edits, but we also need to be careful not to go too far. I pretty much never go more than 10 points plus or minus on any one of these sliders, because again, the farther you move these, the more we depart from reality, and we want to make sure that our portraits look nice and natural. Moving down the line, we have a section called lens corrections. I'm not going to get into color grading in detail. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do in Lightroom, but in the interest of keeping this relatively in the sphere of a beginner profile, we're just going to go through some of the fundamental foundational edits that we can do in the development panel. So again, in the lens correction, this is an interesting panel because basically Lightroom has a huge category of various lenses made by different camera companies. They've got Nikon, Sony, Pentax, and whatever. You imagine it, they've got it. And basically what they do is they've specifically targeted each lens for profile correction. So if I click on this profile correction button, this image was shot with a 70-200 Canon lens. If I click on this, you can see that the image gets a little bit brighter. Some of the fringing, some of the vignetting around the corners on the outsides of the lens just disappeared, and it looks like it went from being kind of spherical to a little bit more flat. Let's toggle this on and off. So this is off, and as you can see, things got a little bit darker around the corners, and the image kind of squunched down a little bit, and if we click it back on, we kind of zoom in ever so slightly, and we eliminate all that vignetting on the outside. Now, this tends to be a bit of a creative decision. A lot of the older lenses, some of the less expensive lenses, tend to have really drastic problems. They have lots of vignetting in the corners. They're maybe not quite as sharp. They're not quite as bright. In this case, this is a very nice lens and it doesn't need a whole lot of correction. So when I turn this button off, I actually think I like it much better in the original format. I've got richer, deeper tones kind of surrounding the outside of the image, and I just like the overall composition a bit better. Moving down the line, transform effects and calibration. We're not going to dive too deeply into these panels because we don't really need to go too far down that rabbit hole. We want to keep this, again, beginner, basic, fundamental, and there is a great deal of power that you can wield using just these initial tools. So for the first part of the development module, we're only going to concern ourselves with this top section right here. For the next part, we have a series of images up here. We've got a radial filter, a graduated neutral density filter, some red eye removal, we've got some clone stamping and some cropping. These are what we would call local edits. They basically enable us to create an edit within a very specific section of the image. For instance, if I grab this radial filter here and I just draw a quick little box right here in the center, what's going to happen is Lightroom only affects what's inside that circle. So this gives us the ability to specifically target our edits in a very, very close proximity. Now we'll get into these local edits in the next chapter. For right now, I'm going to zero this out and we're just going to stick with the basics of our fundamental basic panel. So I'm going to close this and let's get back into our basic panel. So as you can see, down here in our thumbnails collection, we have 7 images that we want to do a first round of edits onto. So within our basic editing panel, I'm going to move over to the right, and typically I like to start with exposure. Again, exposure basically means you make the entire image brighter or you make the entire image darker. Now, one thing that's important to understand about Lightroom is that this software uses a practice called non-destructive editing. So pretty much no matter what I do to this file, I make it brighter, I make it darker, I send the highlights up, I send the blacks down. Let's say that I make some egregious error on this image. I get a little crazy and I start to think, oh my gosh, what have I done? I tried to get too creative and it just didn't work. I ended up with this sort of lightning firestorm of a crap sandwich. Please tell me that I can get this back. Well, fortunately you can, because basically all that Lightroom is doing with these sliders is that it's applying a series of mathematical algorithms on top of the raw data. Lightroom never affects the actual raw data of your file. So no matter what you do to it, you could make this image look completely crazy. You could go this way, that way, completely underexpose it. You could get up, go on a trip to Hawaii, come back 6 weeks later, open Lightroom back up again, and it hasn't actually affected your files. You always have the opportunity to go down, hit reset, and it takes us back to square one. This is the original raw file with no edits made to it whatsoever. So again, Lightroom uses a process called non-destructive editing to apply local edits to your image without actually affecting the original pixels of the file. So no matter what you do, if you go crazy, or if you go a little too dark, a little too bright, what have you, Lightroom is not actually destroying these pixels. You can always go back to square one, and that's very important because it'll keep you from getting into trouble later on down the line. All right, now that we've taken a quick tour of the development module, let's get in here and start making a few edits. I always like to start with exposure because it's one of the foundations of all photography. Either an image is too bright, or it's too dark, or it's just right. In this case, I feel like we're a tad underexposed. We were kind of shooting on a gloomy day. We didn't have a great deal of extra sunlight to help us out. This image was shot at ISO 400 f2.8. We were squeezing as much light as we possibly could out of the last remainder of the day. And I think that this is just a tad underexposed. So I'm going to jump into my exposure bracket here, and I'm going to move this ever so slightly to the right. Now I've gone up 0.45%. Basically, Lightroom works in stops just as your camera does. So if I type in a full 1, that's going to give me a full stop of extra brightness. So it's almost as if I've gone from f4 to f2. Naturally, I don't need that much extra brightness because we're starting to blow out some massive highlights and everything just got a little bit too electrified. So let's zero this back out again. If you are mostly properly exposed on your initial shot, you probably should never need to go more than +1 or -1 on your exposure. Again, your raw file from your camera is only going to give you so much latitude. Let's take a look at Ashley's hair here, and let's see what happens when I just really crank that exposure up and up and up and up and up. So I've gone up a full 2 stops, 2.1, and you can see that I've already started to introduce a great deal of kind of grain and noise into her hair. Lightroom is pulling as much exposure data as it can out of this raw file, and there's just not really enough there to kind of keep this intact. So you want to be careful with your exposure slider. Again, let's zero this back out. Let's zoom back out to our full composition. And I like to think that if we did our due diligence on location and we shot correctly when we were there, we shouldn't have to bring this up or down too much at all. So I'm going to go with 0.25. That's basically just going to lift my overall brightness up just a little bit. It adds a little bit of punch into some of that color, and I can see her eyes a little bit more clearly. That's a nice edit. Now, since I've raised our overall exposure up, I've actually started to burn a little bit of these highlights around here. She's got a little bit of extra light coming in on her nose, a little bit extra on her cheek. Her wrist over here has some extra highlight information. Her shoulder has some extra highlight information. And these bushes here in the background are starting to get a little bit too hot. So next, I want to start grabbing my highlights and I want to ease back on them. I want to bring them down just a little bit. There we go. That actually looks quite a bit better. As you can see, I've eased back on the highlights on her shoulder, and I've definitely taken a lot of that powerful brightness information out of the backdrop. We're going to do a little bit more with the backdrop using a very specific color luminance slider, but we'll get down to that in just a minute. Let's move right along. Shadows. So Shadows and blacks tend to be a little bit tricky. If you're working with somebody who has brunette hair, as Ashley does, if I start moving my shadows down, I start to lose a lot of that information in her hair. So we want to be careful about doing too much with the shadows, especially with people who have dark hair. So let's zero that and that back out. Now, I know a lot of photographers really like to bring up the shadows so that you can start to see all of the detail in the shadows. I'm not entirely sure that I agree with that mentality. I kind of feel like it's okay to have really rich blacks in your image. There's nothing wrong with that. So I'm going to bring my shadows down just a tiny little bit, maybe about 9 points, and the same with the blacks. Let's go about halfway on that. So let's go with 5. Basically what that does is that takes Ashley's dark hair and it makes it ever so slightly darker. We've also increased our shadow information in some of these areas around here. So the environment where we had a little bit of a darker tonality going on, we've brought that down a little bit as well. So that makes for a nice edit. It gives our image just a subtle amount of contrast. Again, we want to be careful with contrast, but this is a pretty good edit. So as you can see, in my primary exposure tablet, I've only done a few tiny subtle little things. We want to be very careful when we edit pictures of people. Human beings are very, very familiar with how human beings should look. So if you start ratcheting up these sliders and going crazy, an image is going to look completely artificial, even to the average viewer, in no time at all. So that's why we want to keep our edits nice and subtle. Let's go with -7 there just to get that back. All right, moving down. And again, I want to stress very seriously that we need to be extremely careful when using the Vibrance and Saturation tabs. Again, new photographers, when you're just beginning, it's easy to get really crazy on these two tabs and start oversaturating your images. You want to be extremely careful about that, because oversaturated skin tones, watch what happens. They just look like absolute sunburn. Ashley looks like a sweet potato Oompa Loompa, and we don't want to do that. Modern cameras actually add a fair amount of extra color saturation into your image as it is, so we don't want to oversaturate skin tones. So when I do portraits, I'm always very careful to pretty much leave both of these sliders alone. You don't need to add extra color into somebody's skin. So moving right along, we have our tone curve. We can go in here and kind of adjust this a little bit. I honestly, just looking at this image, I don't think that it needs anything else, but we can kind of showcase what some of these tools do. So the highlights are going to target the highlight areas, so let's bring those up a little bit. Lights, let's bring those up a little bit. Let's bring our darks down and our shadows down. And again, this creates what we call an S curve. So we've got a little bit of an S going on in our tone curve. As you can see, we've drastically increased the contrast of the image. And once again, I don't think that a super duper contrasty image is a good thing when it comes to working with people. This is really starting to look like one of those super artificial burned out Instagram filters. So for the most part, I'm going to leave this tone curve alone. We can fine tune that later on in Photoshop if you want to. Moving down the line, here we are in our Hsl Color Palette, Hue, Saturation, Luminance. And this is where I want to try to maybe start targeting some of these yellows, which are very, very vibrant and very bright. They're kind of distracting elements. They're not quite 100% out of focus enough so that we're laser focused on Ashley. So let's see what happens when we grab our Luminance tab and I target my yellows and I start to bring my yellows down. If I bring my yellows all the way down, obviously they look a little bit ridiculous. But again, I don't ever want to go more than 10 points on this particular slider. So if I bring this all the way down to, let's call it just -10, let's see what happens. So here's 0 and here's -10. There's just an let's go a few more points just for the sake of this particular tutorial. I'll go all the way down to -19. So basically what we've done is we've targeted the yellows and we've made them darker. Because when we had super duper bright yellow tones back here in the background, that was really creating a distracting element that Ashley is having to visually compete with. So anytime that I can bring my background tones down a little bit, it's going to help Ashley to pop out and really, really make that good connection with the viewer. All right, moving down the line, we come to our last section. Here we are once again at our lens correction. And this really is going to vary according to what camera you shoot, with what lens you shoot. Every single lens is different. And when I click this Enable Profile Corrections, I should see the image get brighter and kind of punch in a little bit. Let's see what happens. Yep, so it did. It got brighter and it kind of punched in a little bit. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I like it better without the profile corrections. So let's turn that off. As you can see, my image has once again taken on a more natural tone. The outside, where the vignetting happens around the outside perimeter, has gotten a little bit darker. That's actually quite natural for how photography works because your lens is spherical and light tends to drop off as it reaches the edge of the sphere. It tends to get brighter in the middle. So that's a pretty cool looking edit. So again, on, bright and flat, off. This is the original. I like the original much better. Again, this particular section will be up to you and your particular creative discretion. All right, so let's roll back up to the top real quick. As you can see, we've only used a select few of these tools. Again, this all, in my opinion, comes down to skin tones. The farther you get away from the original, the more artificial your picture is gonna look. So let's try to take it easy on these sliders when we're working with portraits. All right, moving right along. Let's get to our next image. As we come down the line, I have yet another really nice image. And now here's the beauty of Lightroom. This program enables us to synchronize edits across multiple images. So both of these images are relatively similar. You can see Ashley is more or less sitting in the same place. She's got a different sweater on here as she does right here. But for the most part, we're in the same environment and we have fundamentally the same composition. So what I'm gonna do, just for kicks, is I'm gonna go down here at the bottom, I'm gonna hit this button that says Previous. And what this will do is this will apply all of the edits that I made in my previous image to this new image. Watch what happens. Click that, and as you can see, all of the sliders for this new image have taken on the exact parameters from the previous image. And if I'm being honest, I feel like that looks like a pretty good edit. I don't have to go through and meticulously redo every last one of these. Again, because these two images, let's go over here, were shot under such similar circumstances, I feel like the same edits work really nicely for both images. So let's click the reset button right here, and we'll go back to our original raw file. Not a whole lot's changed, but I actually do like the way that those edits work. So once again, I'm gonna grab this image, and I'm gonna move over one, I'm gonna hit Previous, and it's gonna apply those previous images. So let's go on down the line. Once again, very similar to our last one. If I hit Previous, I still get a lot of nice looking edits right there. Moving down the line. Okay, again, same environment, same fundamental composition. Let's do Previous here. And that changes a couple of things up. In this case, this one's not 100% identical to the last stuff that we've done. So what I want to do, I can feel like this is a little bit ever so slightly underexposed still. So I can do one of two things. I can start to ease back on my highlights. Let's grab our highlights and bring them back closer to 0. That's nice there. And let's actually maybe punch another couple little points of exposure value into this. So I'm going to go up to 0.35. And that makes it ever so slightly brighter. And now I can see I've gone a little bit too far because some of the tones in Ashley's nose here are starting to get a little bit too bright for my comfort. So I'm gonna grab those highlights, which tend to be focusing a little bit more on her brighter skin. And let's bring those highlights down just a little bit. That kind of brings her more back to reality. All right, very cool. Moving right along. Again, shot under the same circumstances, fundamentally the same composition. Let's hit the Previous button. And that's a pretty nice looking edit there. On to our next image, Previous. That looks like a fairly nice edit. This one still feels a little bit darker. This was getting closer to the end of the day. The sun was going down. We had less light to work with. So let's punch yet another tiny little bit of exposure up in here. We're at 0.35. I'm just gonna go to 0.45. That lifts up our exposure just a little bit, gives it that bright vibrance. That's a nice edit. And then these two images were shot almost simultaneously to one another. So when I hit the Previous button, boom, that brings me right back up online. And we're looking pretty darn good. All right, I'm gonna hit the G key on the keyboard. It's gonna bring us back to our library module where we can see all of our thumbnails again. Let's just make these thumbnails nice and big. And when we roll up, and we can see we have made our first round of actual development module edits to our images. So let's pop back into the development module. And let's go to our first image. And let's just kind of cycle through these really quick. I like the way this one's coming together. Once again, this looks nice and bright and vibrant. I haven't overdone the skin tones or the saturation. This one looks like a nice edit. Again, all of these edits should be very similar to one another because they were shot under similar conditions, and we have just copied our edits from one image to the next with a few minor tweaks in between. So as you can see, in just a few short minutes, we've jumped into Lightroom's powerful raw editing tools and we made some really good looking corrections to these images. This basically just covers the foundations of the development module. We haven't gone into any of our local editing tools. So the foundations of the development module give you really, really strong raw editing capabilities. In our case, we've actually shot really darn good images straight out of the camera, so we didn't have to do a whole heck of a lot to these images. Sometimes you make a little bit of a mistake, you get your exposure off, you might love an image and you have to do a lot of really drastic raw editing to get that image to kind of come back. But in our case, fortunately, Premium Light Academy, we tend to shoot things pretty well on site. And so our editing tends to be very, very small. And I consider that to be a good thing, especially if you are a beginner. So this showcases a few of the fundamentals in the development panel. In the next chapter, we're going to take it even farther and we're going to use some of these local editing tools to do some really cool looking stuff. Let's just give a quick example of how we can really kind of start to manipulate this image and make it look so much better. Just by darkening the background alone, we've really made Ashley pop out so the viewer just can't help but focus directly on her. So again, in the next module, we will focus in on some local edits to really start to fine tune these images. I can't wait to get started, and we'll see you in the next lesson.
Finally, we get to the good stuff. We can start taking creative control over our images using the development module. Now, in the next chapter, we'll go even farther into the development module to show you how you can improve your pictures even more. In the meantime, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. We have a lot of cool new stuff coming up, and I don't want you to miss it. So we'll see you in the next lesson.